So as we hold Trans Remembrance Day in our church, we lit this candle today, and we've named the names of the 22 or so, 24 who have died, remembering that 4 of those were in Dallas. We hold out that all people, no matter what their gender, will be loved and will be safe. And today we're exploring in our series on enough. I said at the first service, I think when we started the series said enough, exclamation point, right? Yes. Thinking about our society. We preached on enough. Do we have enough time? Do we have enough grace, etc.? Let us add today, are we enough? In this series, I think we're coaching you out of that rat race, competition-only mindset that seems to infect the world so deeply today. That winning at all costs, my kid is better than yours, we're going to compete for spots in college or attention or anything else you can think of mindset. We are all ill with this attitude, and it fails us every time, because it shoves us further from who we really are. It makes us feel less than who we are. Now, I imagine not one person in here can be honest and say they have never felt that feeling of not being enough. Not a good enough parent, not a good enough friend, not a good enough child, not a good enough lover, partner, employee, or anything else you can think of. We've all had that sense. It's not even to mention the beginning of the absurd level of noise that we have accepted about who is good looking and sexy enough and young looking, all that makes us mostly feel bad about ourselves, challenging us to self-acceptance and more. That's at the core of today's question: do we have grace for ourselves? Now, I heard a story recently I want to share with you. It was by a woman named Randy Skaggs. She described herself as a Kentucky girl who graduated college and made that move to New York City to make it in the theater, right? This is a typical country girl moves to the big city story in some ways. She moves to New York, but her friend says you can really get a cheap apartment in just a neighboring town. It's called Newark. And this was 20 or 30 years ago, so any of those of you know Newark 20 or 30 years ago, no, that wasn't some good advice. She moves in, she makes no money, she's living in what she calls an HBO miniseries on urban decline. When she goes to the bus every morning, which she has to take to the train, to the subway, which takes 3 hours total commute, she's taunted by the pimps and the prostitutes at the bus station. And so she decides to go across the street to an abandoned train station to wait and watch for her bus. One day she was waiting there, hidden in this train station, and a homeless man came up to her and said, "Give me money." And she'd been in New York long enough to know what to do, so she handed some change to the man, and he said, no, real money. She said, "Really? I have no money." And then she did what any country girl in the city would do. She showed him her wallet. And he said, "Well, what about that ATM card? There's an ATM down the street." And she thought, well, I don't think more seclusion is a good idea here. She thinks, I can run, but I'm slow. And then he says to her, I've killed before, so how about the money? She says she got so scared, she did what she usually does when she's scared. She starts to talk. She starts to tell this homeless man, I came to Newark, to be a success. I have nothing. I sleep on the floor in my apartment because I can't afford furniture. I eat ramen noodles. And my feminist theater is terrible. She says her friends called her and said, wow, New York, so glamorous. And she can't tell them it's Newark. And then she gets even sappier and she says, "Don't kill me, I just want to see my mom again." At which point she looks over to the homeless man, and he's looking at her. With a tear in his eye, he gives her a big bear hug. She said it was her only human contact in months. And then he says, "Don't leave New York. You're going to be a success. You're going to do something great." And then he wanders off. At this point in the Christian church, the preacher says she looked into his eyes and realized he was Jesus, and she was saved. She had a different conclusion about crossing boundaries, but what I hear in this story is that in this vulnerable moment, she was finally able to be honest with herself. She was at a moment when she was not believing in herself, but she was given some hope by a stranger in an abandoned train station. She was loved back into being. She saw that life wasn't perfect, that she wasn't perfect, but she realized that she had everything she needed to be who she really was if she was honest, if she was open. I think she moved back to Kentucky. She held her head high and became a teacher to love children into being. But none of that happens until she comes clean with herself about who she is. Jolted from the illusions by a homeless man in an abandoned train station in Newark, New Jersey. And what I just told you, I think, is our version of a salvation story. This preacher doesn't say she saw Jesus and somehow accepted him as God and Savior and was magically saved. Because in our theology, Jesus was never a perfect God to follow to salvation. Our ancestors asked, how could we follow someone who was perfect when we know ourselves not to be? They said we need an imperfect model to lead us to the salvation of our souls. So for them, salvation was not a belief in Jesus, but rather in trying to act like Jesus, to being true to oneself, beholden to no authority but the highest one can find, loving others into being and making the world a little better than when we arrived. The Unitarians drew this distinction with Jesus and God. They said, and we say, we are not striving for perfection. By the way, that's kind of a Methodist thing. Unitarian thing. We are not striving for perfection. The only result of such striving is feeling like broken, miserable failures in need of repair by God. We say the only perfection in the world is in God's moral perfection, which is something to strive toward, something that resides deep within us and beyond us. So for the Unitarian ancestors, God was moral perfection. Jesus was the model, and our work was to strive for moral perfection, not the perfection of the soul. Our job was and then and is today to strive to make moral decisions and actions that emulate God. The Unitarians back then said the pious one among us can be observed loving and serving his neighbors, living an upright life, disciplining his thoughts and desires, and revealing an inner striving toward the moral perfection of God. They said we do this striving by working for the greater good. by loving our fellow human siblings, by knowing that we already have everything we need to be agents of a God of love, and thus having the confidence in ourselves that we are not sinners in the hands of God, but we are enough as we are. And this is salvation for us. Knowing this and acting on it. In the last few weeks, I have heard numerous salvation stories that reflect this from people in this church. Life and death stories. They say I was feeling lost and out of touch with who I was and what my purpose was. One even said he was close to the breaking point, like in the reading today. And then I came in here and I was loved into being, reminded that deep in my heart is a love so holy that no one can take that away. And that I didn't have to compare myself to others or fight for salvation, because it is in my awakening to my purpose and in taking small actions to love others into being and make the world a better place that salvation is there. This is what the Love Beyond Belief groups are all about, by the way, in a nutshell. To make space for spiritual depth and reflection and action and fun while loving each other into being, so that we can fully reveal what we are struggling with and who we are and what we love, and come to an honest place with ourselves, like the woman in Newark in that train station. Because that moment beats back the competition mindset. It beats back the perfectionism mindset. A mindset that hands over our salvation to something else. It makes us lose sight of the fact that we already have what we need. Now we have to put it into practice. This is why the testimony of a trans Christian woman in a UU church is so important. The reading that Aaron read today, I reached out to Felicia. She gave me permission to share her testimony and thanked me. And I think she, like so many LGBTQIA plus people, that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and asexual plus people, you're going to have to go look that up for yourself. So many LGBTQIA plus people have received the message in church that they were outside the norm, that they were somehow flawed and beyond repair and unwelcome by religion. I'm sure that many, many stories in this sanctuary today reflect religion being weaponized in some pure form or pure ritual of community that said you do not belong or you do not count. For the transgender community, it is worse than for any one of us who's not transgender. And this church has done the work saying to lesbian, gay, and bisexual people for over 50 years that they are welcome, and beyond that, they are important, they are leaders, we are here for you. We continue that work today, now joining the movement to see to TQI and A plus people as important to the work of God in this congregation. A movement that loves us all into being, no matter who we are. That's why our new building will have non-gendered bathrooms, complete rooms with a commode and a door, because the future is not binary gendered expressions. It is The future is multifaceted. And the future of this church says to so many, like the children in our church school right now who are TQIA, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual, that when they walk through this building, they know they are loved into being. I have been in so many conversations with parents in Dallas and beyond in the last 5 years about their transgender children as I navigated my family's self-awakening in support of trans members of our family. held so many in prayer and sought out communities that were built here in this place that cared about a child who said, "I am not the gender of my birth." Imagine the "you are not enough" message those children receive in our world. I've been in Children's Hospital at the Genesis program, the preeminent world-class transgender program for children in downtown Dallas, talking to parents and grandparents who lived in communities where their transgender child would be in danger if anyone knew what was going on. I've heard stories of homeschooling so that trans children could have some peace from bullying and so on. Trans Remembrance Day is Wednesday. It hurts me to the core to read that list, because those deaths are only because hatred shrinks love and hides behind violence when we can't see people into being. It's why the suicide rate is so high in trans teens. It's 1 out of 2. Because the message they receive in our society, and yes, in churches all over the country, is that they are not enough. And I can tell you that when a trans person stands in front of a mirror and knows what they see is different from who they are, it's a hurdle that most of us will rarely even begin to understand. Our religion calls us to make space for everyone to be who they are, to know that they are enough, to reiterate the call that we have what we need, and to remind each other of that fact. And all this starts with having enough grace for ourselves, knowing that we will make mistakes and we will fail, but who we are and what we do isn't the same thing. Deep within each of us is the seed of the holy that is loving. That even when we fail those we love, it's there. Deep within us is the seed of generosity, that even when we fail to express it, it is there. When we love each other and ourselves into existence, we cross the boundaries of our society that wants to say, "You are not enough." We reveal that holy seed and live into salvation in real and impactful ways. So I want to end with Baby Suggs, the reading I read earlier. What I love about Baby Suggs is she isn't preaching that those slaves she's preaching to are sinners in the hands of an angry God. She is preaching a beautiful exhortation to victorious self-love, communal affirmation of each other, and spirituality of personhood. She is, in a sense, preaching universalism, that God is way beyond the rules that isolate and diminish us. It's an absolutely triumphal speech. And I want you to remember the words of this speech the next time you feel outside the boundaries of yourself. The next time you lose track of that love that is so deep inside that holds you. Next time you forget that you can forgive yourself and in turn love another. The next time you think you are not enough, I want you to hear the words of the slave preacher from Beloved. So love your neck. Put a hand on it. Grace it, stroke it, hold it up, and all your inside parts that they just as soon slop for hogs, you gotta love them. The dark, dark liver, love it. Love it. And the beat and beating heart, love that too. More than eyes or feet, hear me now. Love your heart, for this is the prize. Amen.